Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., and this is now our Christmas program. It's December 21st here in Washington, and time for the next to last program of the old year of 2012. The apocalyptic thinkers, right? The people who expected the end of the world have been disappointed so far. The Mayan calendar does not seem to be kicking in. We don't have the Mayan apocalypse, but we have the Maya apocalypse. We'll talk about that in our second segment. That is the austerity ghoul Maya McGinnis as a kind of typical harpy or fury tormenting humanity with genocidal austerity. We'll get to her in the second part of the program. But, if you listen to Ron Paul's standard stump speech in his campaign, it was full of apocalyptic ideas. For some reason, always hyperinflation. Never deflation, always hyperinflation. That doesn't seem to come about. As the scripture says, you don't know when. Right? You do not know when. Believe me, you don't know when. And as I would add, every prediction of the end of the world has a definite class content. And when Helicopter Ben Bernanke coined the term, the fiscal cliff, earlier this year, he did that as part of a very specific strategy of ruling class demagogy designed to advance the interests of the parasitic banking elite and the lunatic ruling class, the so-called 1%. We are now in the midst of the haggling over this fiscal cliff, this chimera. There is, of course, there is real damage that is set to occur, but the idea that this is somehow the end of the world, this is wrong, and also it's perfectly susceptible to being cured after the fact in the new year. It was widely admitted this week, even in the controlled media, that if you're on the side of working people, you have no particular phobia about allowing the Bush tax cuts to lapse. That can then be fixed relatively easily. But the idea that somehow it's a public interest to avoid the Bush tax cuts, that you think about that, right? That we have to hang on to what Bush did. Well, this is also fallacy, and it plays into the hands of the reactionaries. But now we've got the Republican reactionaries that have, for the moment, blocked Obama's attempt for a sellout. Obama was determined to exact his pound of flesh. He wanted to impose the controlled consumer price index, the so-called chained CPI, the chained consumer price index. And this is a way to gouge Social Security. And a breathtaking reversal. Going into the haggling about the fiscal cliff, Obama, the man of the people, who ran on a platform of defending the entitlements, although if you were reading carefully, as some of us were, you could see that he intended no such thing, that he was always eager for a sellout. But in his campaign, he tried to give the dupes, the low-information voters, the notion that he was there to defend entitlements, the social safety net, your economic rights as validated by the New Deal, the Great Society, and the New Frontier. But he said at the beginning, Social Security is off the table. And suddenly, in the course of this past week, Social Security came back in through the back door in time to be looted and chiseled and gouged and sacked. And this is the chained CPI. This is a piece of monstrosity. You've often heard it said on this program, the difference between Romney and Obama was what? Well, that Romney was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a madman coming at you with a chainsaw and determined to impose killer cuts immediately, right? To basically hack everybody into succotash in the first 3 minutes. With the case of Obama, it's the death of 1,000 cuts. And that is what the chained CPI would do to the average Social Security benefit, right? We have the shills of MSNBC, Larry O'Donnell, or whatever his name is, this nonentity who does the 10 o'clock program on MSNBC. He assures us, oh, well, the chained CPI, that would only mean 1%. Yeah, 1% maybe the first year, but in the successive years, it's going to be 1% and 1% and 1% and maybe more on compound interest. The trick is that they want to understate inflation. This is not the first time they've done it. Going back 20 years, pick up a copy of Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History, the first edition, 1999, and the second edition, 2009. You will find in there a discussion of a similar gouging and falsification of the Consumer Price Index carried out by the infamous Michael Boskin, who was a creature of the first Bush administration, that is to say, of Bush the Elder. And his story was that the existing CPI of the Labor Department at that point, the market basket of goods and their prices, he said it overstated inflation. It said that inflation was too much, and therefore the entitlement beneficiaries were getting increases that were too generous, right? Their cost of living allowances and adjustments were too big. So already with Boskin 20 years ago, there was a first gouging and reduction in the way that the actual rate of inflation is reflected, right? It's clear to everybody. You can go to these libertarians, for example, at Shadow Government Statistics and see their estimate of what the Consumer Price Index really has been. It has been much more than what the government is willing to admit. And you don't have to be a Ron Paul freak to recognize that fact. But so now we got the second round. So what the idea is that over time, Social Security would wither on the vine. The benefit would become less and less and less until eventually it dried up and blew away. That's the chained CPI. Now, Boehner, from a position of overwhelming weakness, of ideological isolation and being on the defensive, can nevertheless rely, could and can, on Obama to try not just to bail him out, but to shower him with concessions that he could never get in a real negotiation. We've always said Obama negotiates with himself, a strange habit that he has. Obama negotiates with himself. At the beginning, you may recall, he wanted $1.6 trillion of revenue. Well, actually, let me go back even further. Before this year, before this current haggling session, back in the spring of 2011, Obama already granted $1 trillion in killer cuts. And I say killer cuts because any cuts in social programs represent genocide. They will kill people. It's a big difference. You can raise taxes on the rich by 5% or 10%, sure in the knowledge that you're not killing anybody. But if you gouge 5 to 10% out of food stamps or Medicaid or Medicare or unemployment benefits, you can be sure that human lives will be lost. Dead bodies will result. That is why the current austerity proposals represent high crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg Code, the implied precedents of the Nuremberg trials, Germany 1946, where austerity ghouls of that age, also known as Nazis, were hanged for what they did. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., our special Christmas program. We will have some holiday atmosphere here before too long, but we've got to bring you up to date, first of all, on the infamy and treachery of Obama, the reactionary furor of Boehner and his gang of Republican thugs. This is plain to all to see. Quite a few still having trouble seeing the depth of the treachery of Obama. So we got through 2011 as a result of the events of 2010 and 2011. Obama had signed off on $1 trillion, a lot of that killer cuts, a lot of it targeting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. He had already targeted those cuts, and he had, as part of Obamacare, one of the main things wrong with Obamacare is that contains between $500 billion and $700 billion, according to the accounting you use, of cuts. Those are killer cuts. They may not be cuts to the benefits received by individuals nominally, but when you go and cut payments to hospitals, payments to laboratories, payments to other key parts of the healthcare delivery system, that will also lead to increased morbidity and mortality. Those are killer cuts. This is not comparable to the effect of tax increases on rich people. Those do not kill. But cutting into these programs on which people rely who have no other recourse, those are cuts that kill. Therefore, the Nuremberg precedents should be the basic moral backdrop of what we're talking about here, and not the current policy wonk inside the Beltway debate, where these proposals for genocide are entertained as if they were just, another policy variation. So, between 2010 and 2011, Obama manages to deliver $1 trillion of budget cuts, mainly in the spring of 2011, $500 billion to $700 billion of cuts in Medicare and Medicaid as part of his Obamacare. By the end of 2010, he had extended the Bush tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires for another 2 years. That's the essentially the deadline that we're coming up to now. So that was already a very, very one-sided performance. Nobody in the wealthy elite called upon to cough up even an additional penny to deal with this crisis of debt, which they are the ones who claim is the existential crisis. And it's not good, although it's not at all the hysteria, not worth the hysteria that these rich parasites are willing to bring up. And then we get Obama with the Satan sandwich, right? What we're living through now is a result of the Satan sandwich of August of 2011, which set up this situation with the sequester. Remember the 12 tyrants, the super committee, they were supposed to agree, they didn't agree, therefore we have this sequester, which has a lot of problems with the sequester. It will, among other things, have a terrible impact on the National Institutes of Health here, just a little bit north of Washington, D.C. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Obama then comes into this current discussion. At the beginning, he says he wants $1.6 trillion of increased revenue, mainly in the form of tax cuts on the people over $250,000 per year income. That $1.6 trillion then turns into $1.4 trillion, and then turns into $1.2 trillion, without any compensating or completely trifling compensating concessions from this fascist gang of Republicans. So we've got a Wall Street shill, Obama, who is programmed to cave in, right? His treachery, his weakness, his cowardice, his status as a Wall Street agent, none of this has ever changed. He does the same thing. He's got a new aureola of mystical devotion from his acolytes on MSNBC. And at the same time, Obama is offering another $400 billion, an additional $400 billion in health care cuts. Now, let's see. We've got guaranteed $500 to $700 billion already cut under Obamacare, at least in terms of the authorization. $400 billion more. It gets us almost to $1.5 trillion, plus some money out of that trillion of cuts 2010, 2011. You can see Obama is putting up a heavy attack. He was putting that together with a mere $100 billion of defense cuts and $100 billion of domestic discretionary, which is also, these are also very, very misguided. If you want to make defense cuts, you better put in the money to reconvert, and you better have a space program and an energy program and a mass transit program so that you can reconvert seamlessly those defense industries into the technological future of the country. You simply shut those things down. That's committing national suicide. I'm sorry. Ultra-lefts don't want to hear that. But those are the only modern capabilities we have in many areas. So that's a trump card you do not throw away just for the sake of being an ultra-left. So that's Obama. And then on top of this, we get the chained CPI. Now, this should not be a surprise. If you recall, and if you have your copy of Surviving the Cataclysm handy, go and read about Obama's interview with the editorial board of the Washington Post during the week before his inauguration in January 2009. And you will see there that he talks about the main tasks of his administration being things that he never mentioned on his idiotic campaign trail, his demagogic exercise in the Messiah and the Mahdi and walking on water and utopian and millenarian rhetoric. But he said we have to tame Social Security and Medicare. And he said Social Security is relatively easy and Medicare is more difficult because the cost overruns are greater. That was the real secret program of Obama. He's an austerity Democrat. He's in the infamous tradition of Woodrow Wilson, of Al Smith, of Harry S. Truman, of Adlai Stevenson, of Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, and so forth. And Clinton, too, because Clinton is the one who first began the modern Democratic Party's assault on the New Deal by attacking aid to families with dependent children, AFDC. That's called welfare. That's one of the reasons why you have 50 million Americans destitute, living on the edge of starvation, with nothing but about $1.50 per person per meal through food stamps, which Boehner wants to cut. Boehner's Plan B includes killer cuts to food stamps. Okay, this is what we're getting ahead of the story here a little bit. But let's just focus on the chain CPI. During the course of the week, Boehner says, I want more concessions. I'm a gangster. Cough up more concessions. I want to tamper with the existing cost of living escalator, the existing consumer price index. I'm going to instruct the Labor Department to ignore a large part of existing inflation. That's a recipe for letting it wither on the vine to subject Social Security to the death of 1,000 cuts. That's Obama's program, and he's sticking with it. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Boehner demands the chained consumer price index, which means the slow death of Social Security, the gradual immiseration and impoverishment of millions of older people, and generally the lowering of the standard of living here in the United States. And Obama falls all over himself to make the concession. And you can see this is a charade. In other words, the presence of the fascisto Republicans and their right-wing lunatic Tea Party faction is a welcome pretext for Obama. It's a kind of deus ex machina in his dramaturgical apparatus to impose the kind of killer austerity that Obama believes in just as much and maybe more than these Republican thugs. Now, let's just look back. People, you turn on the television in the season, you're going to find A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Scrooge. You're going to find this story. One of the critical moments in it is the appearance of the ghost of Jacob Marley. It's Christmas Eve. There's fog and cold in London. We're in the era of primitive accumulation. We're back in the time of the monster debt. We're back in the time of the treadmill, the poorhouse, the poor law, and terrible suffering for the English people in those days. But Scrooge gets back to his home that evening. It's a mansion, but most of the rooms are filled with dust and crates. He only lives in a few rooms. And at a certain point, there appears the ghost of his partner, Jacob Marley, dead 7 years. These, of course, were grasping, greedy old sinners. They both of them shared the same outlook. Here's Scrooge. He was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, this Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Solitary as an oyster, a frosty rime was over his head. I'm thinking of Al Simpson. If we were going to cast this today, the misanthrope, right, the austerity ghoul, Al Simpson might be good for this role. But anyway, he's now back in his house. He's got this little bowl of gruel, hot soup, thin soup that he's heated up on his fire in his fireplace. And down in the bowels of this house, the subcellar, he can hear a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge remembered he had heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. And at a certain point, the door flies open, and this spirit enters, and he recognizes the ghost of his long-dead partner, Jacob Marley, right, the two partners in the counting house and on the London Stock Exchange. And, of course, it looks just like Marley. We don't need to go through how it looks like Marley, but he's got a chain. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, and we know what it looked like because Scrooge observed it closely, it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so Scrooge, observing him, could look through his waistcoat, his vest, and you could see that the two buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now. Sounds like Al Simpson, but I'm thinking of the ghost of Marley as the future punishment that awaits people like Boehner and Obama and the others who come forward and say, let's institute the chained consumer price index, the chains that are wrapped around Marley. And you can see this one very good version, the American Christmas Carol of the late 1930s with Reginald Denny and Gene Lockhart, has Leo G. Carroll, the guy who later played Topper, right? He was all about ghosts, and he's dragging these chains. Or I guess the best of all the versions is the British one with Alistair Sim of 1951. But they've all got it, right, to be at the Disney cartoon or any of them. It's interesting that when you get down to the Tory spelling version, the whole economic dimension has just about disappeared, and the only thing you get is whether people are mean or nice in their personal relations. This shows the inability of modern U.S. civilization to even pose the issues as of about 10 years ago. But he's dragging the chain, and you got to ask him, can you sit down? I can. Then do it. So you get the idea. The whole world of the Christmas Carol is precisely the kind of economics that animates this haggling about the fiscal cliff. As a general principle, if you insist on approaching the world economic depression from the side of deficits and debt, that is to say, the crisis as it's mirrored in government finance, you'll always fail. Because within the narrow realm of the federal budget, one way or another, the solution is not to be found. The solution lies, if you approach it from the point of view of employment, employment and unemployment, and therefore of general economic activity. In other words, production. When you look at employment, wages, and production, this is where you can begin to see the solutions to a world economic depression. But attempting to cure a world economic depression by cutting the budgets of various governments, this makes absolutely no sense. You cannot take a collapsed world economy and get it going again with more deflationary austerity measures. And again, the saddest precedent is that of Brüning, 1930 to 1932, a cut of 25% in the overall German budget, and what do you get? Falling production, rising debt, increased misery, and totalitarianism in the form of Hitler about 6 months after Brüning left office. So here's what is being proposed now in Washington, D.C. The punishment is to be fettered and shackled and chained to the apparatus of what? Of greed, of the property title, the absolute supremacy of debt and promises to pay. And, of course, when compared to the necessity for human survival, we, I hope, all know better. But let's just think about the ideological background, right? The young Dickens, at least, he has a phase of reactionary, well, let's say he has a phase of romantic anti-capitalism, right? If you look at the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, he's interested in Merry England. He's interested in some idyllic halcyon utopia that really never was, clearly. Mr. Pickwick on the ice, everybody jolly, and so forth. This never existed. By the time he settles down, some years after that, he can actually understand some social problems. When the two, we'll just talk about the are there no prisons here in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our Christmas program. A couple of further extracts from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. You remember when the two gentlemen come into Scrooge's counting house and ask him for a contribution for a fund to buy some meals for the poor at Christmas time. An intelligent financier would regard this as a very good investment in counterinsurgency. That is some kind of a token payment, doesn't change anything, keeps the property relations, and creates some goodwill so that maybe the mass strike won't happen in the following year. But like the Tea Party, right, the low-wage employer Scrooge says, no, remember, he's a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He doesn't want to contribute anything. He's very aware of what he's been paying for. So they come to him and say, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time above all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What can I put you down for? Nothing. And Scrooge says, the famous exchange is Scrooge says, are there no prisons? Plenty of prisons. And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? I wish they were not, but they are. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then, both very busy. Many can't go there, say the gentleman. Many would rather die. And from Scrooge, then we get the summation of the Malthusian, monetarist, David Ricardo, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, classic liberal economics. And this is what we saw with Ron Paul and the rest of these characters. What it comes down to is, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. So that's Scrooge. Now, what the Marley's ghost tries to tell him is that the path even to personal salvation or a meaningful personal life, maybe in somebody else's terms, is that your spirit has to walk abroad. In other words, you've got to exercise charity towards larger population groups than just yourself. And as Marley puts it, the Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, wherever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for the vast means of usefulness. And that's Marley's punishment, that he has to float across the world on the wings of the wind, buffeted, and he can't intervene in human affairs in order to alleviate human suffering. And Scrooge then objects that you have to stick to your business. Business, cries Marley's ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare, sounds like the general welfare, was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Well, you get the idea. The spirit of charity, right? There's faith, hope, and charity is the greatest of the three. And I've talked at various times in the past, my program for world reconciliation is essentially to take the Christian charity supported, at least in theory, by 1.5 billion people, put that together with the Muslim notion of social solidarity, another billion plus, and the Confucian concept of benevolence, as we see it in the Analects, right? The imperative to look at a population, make them prosperous, and then to educate them. Those are the imperatives of natural law and human civilization. Those three form already a broad platform for cooperation. Ironically, in this season, when you can get at least some sketchy idea of the Christmas Carol, the Scrooge story, just about every time you turn on a television set, we are getting the opposite. We're getting the reactionary Boehner and the Wall Street Democrat Obama, and we've gone through it. Now, here's the irony, is that the voters who, in their benighted gullibility, allowed Obama into the White House in the first place, and the ones that have now voted for him, you could imagine supporting Obama for saying, well, he's the lesser evil compared to Romney. That's a cogent argument. But to think that Obama is a dedicated proponent and defender of Social Security and the New Deal, you're certifiable. That's exactly what he's not. His whole thrust of his entire administration, and indeed the modern Democratic Party in general, is that they want to destroy the New Deal. There are no more dedicated enemies of the New Deal than the majority of the Democratic Party. But the irony now of the past 24 hours, and again, we're speaking on the 21st of December, Friday, is that it's the reactionaries, the Tea Party lunatics, the most fascistic, the most extreme. They are the ones who are saving you from Obama and from the chained CPI. And it took this form. Boehner attempting to maneuver. He was on a path towards an austerity deal with Obama up until the beginning of this week. But and this would have included the chained consumer price index. It would have included tax increases on the rich. Boehner said above $1 million. Obama gave up on that too. He, instead of saying 250,000 was the cutoff, he raised that to 400,000. But at a certain point, Boehner said, "No, that's no good. We have to have more cuts, and we're only going to have the tax increases above $1 million." Boehner's plan B was to extend the Bush tax cuts for everybody below $1 million in yearly income. Above $1 million, it would go from 35% to 39.6%. So that's the Clinton rate would be restored. Would raise the capital gains tax from 15% to 20%, extend the current tax exemption on estates up to $5.12 million, and it would also, sweeteners added in for the reactionaries, avoid the automatic cuts for the Pentagon. The Pentagon would be exempt from sequester but not the other parts of government. And instead, Boehner wants to cut mortgage relief. In other words, this minimal, really inadequate joke program, but something, really more window dressing than anything else. The mortgage relief would be cut. Food stamps would be cut. In this season of the year, when want is most keenly felt and abundance rejoices, Boehner says $1.50 per meal is too much. We're going to cut it. Pellagra, scurvy, rickets, that's Boehner's middle name. He wants to cut the child tax credit. It's communistic. Cut the obesity prevention program. But above all, food stamps. Remember, there are 50 million people who get food stamps and nothing but. No job, unemployment benefits gone, no health care, there's no more aid to families with dependent children, there's nothing. There's just food stamps. When they say welfare, that's what they mean. Welfare is gone. There's no such thing. So that was Boehner's proposal. Now, the objection from the Tea Party fanatics was that that's not reactionary enough. So yesterday evening, Thursday the 20th of December, Boehner gave up for the moment. He sent his caucus home. They're going to be back sometime after Christmas, not clear when, probably the 27th or the 28th of December, and then we'll go into the final phase. And the irony is the immediate prospect of the chain CPI has been at least postponed, not by Obama, who was eager for Treasury, but by these reactionaries. Evil does good in spite of itself. The only way this universe has survived so far. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio, our Christmas program 2012, recording here on Friday, December 21st. Chaos on the Hill. Boehner's debacle. The Republican Party is in a shambles. Well, hallelujah. That's a great day. We had very dramatic events yesterday, Thursday, the 20th of December, and something happened in the course of the 24 hours between Wednesday, the 19th, and Thursday, the 20th. Something flipped inside the Republican Party. On Wednesday, we had Boehner and Cantor and the rest of these reprobates running around saying, oh, we have the votes. We're going to pass Plan B and send it to the Senate, and then we can bargain more effectively with Obama from the point of view of that legislation. And we've got one of Boehner's acolytes is Congressman LaTourette, and LaTourette loves to talk about the Tea Party. The Tea Party now seems to be about 40 diehard lunatic reactionaries. He calls them the chuckleheads. The chuckleheads of the Tea Party seem to be cowed into submission, so much so that between Wednesday and Thursday, we had a number of prominent reactionary voices, some of them quite extreme, essentially saying that Boehner's proposal to formally raise tax rates, marginal federal income tax rates on plutocrats earning over $1 million, that would be okay. So we had Grover Norquist, my God, Grover Norquist, with an exercise in casuistry, was able to portray the Boehner Plan B as actually a tax cut, because he said, looking ahead 10 days, of course, that's what it would be for the rest of the population. And everybody below 1 million would be allowed to keep their existing rates, so that would add up to a cut. So with some sophistry like this, Norquist was supporting it. Even the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, were supporting Boehner on this one. But then, sometime between Wednesday and Thursday, something flipped. Something changed. I don't know what it is. Maybe one of the Koch brothers got up on the wrong side of the bed, or something inside the Republican Party changed. The 40 lunatic reactionaries were revivified, And by Thursday afternoon, it was clear that Boehner had not held the vote. He couldn't get the votes. Then there was a meeting of the Republicans about 7 o'clock. And in the course of this, you can see the degradation of this process. We have Mark Levin, radio personality. This is a raging, raving, psychotic id, a homunculus. He put out tweets that the rebellion was in full force and down with Boehner and so forth. And then Boehner, fighting back tears as usual, had to admit, he had to concede that he didn't have the votes. And when Cantor left the meeting, he seemed to be pretty chipper, I can imagine, although they say that he was doing his level best. I don't think so. Remember, in the Republican Party, there is a tradition of stealth putches. These were attempted against Gingrich at least once to twice before he was finally ousted as Speaker, right? The Republicans do this. It's very much a palace politics, right? Palace coup inside the Republican conference, the Republican caucus of the House of Representatives. So this, however, is a very interesting situation because this hurts Obama in terms of his austerity ghoul orientation, right? His demand for genocidal austerity, focusing on this chained CPI, getting Social Security back on the table. And the clear implication, you could even see this on MSNBC yesterday evening, is if the Republicans are in chaos, if Boehner is nobody with whom you can negotiate, why do you continue making concessions to somebody who counts for nothing, a non-entity like Boehner? Even Boehner said it's up to Obama and Harry Reid. So should Obama and Harry Reid make concessions to each other in the form of the chained consumer price index? In other words, the pretext, the excuse that Obama would cite in his quest for genocidal austerity, this is now collapsed. In other words, this monster, I'm thinking if you look in the Dante's Divine Comedy, right, when you come to Pluto, Virgil picks up some handfuls of dirt, throws them at Pluto, and the monster deflates. It's very formidable, but then you express your scorn, you throw something at him, and he deflates. Well, now, Boehner is one deflated Pluto in terms of his ability to exact concessions. So now the question is, can Obama bring Boehner back from the dead politically? Can he revivify him somehow so that he can then justify making concessions to this boogeyman that he himself would be reanimating? So that's the situation. I can just assure you of one thing. Obama is scheming right now how to stab you in the back, how to sell you out, how to strip you of your economic rights, how to continue the attack begun by Clinton. Obama thinks to himself, my God, Clinton was able to destroy aid to families with dependent children. That's one of the titles of the Social Security Act of 1935. Clinton destroyed that one, and Obama's got to say, I've at least got to put Social Security on the path to destruction, to withering on the vine, to the death of 1,000 cuts. That's the holiday spirit, according to Obama. He's scheming even now. Now, apart from this tragic and horrendous situation, when you get right down to it, what we've just described is the reason that the Democratic Party needs to split into two parts. In other words, the promise inherent in the current situation is that the Republican Party could easily collapse as a national party, and it could dwindle into a regional party in the South and the far West, the Intermountain West, for racists and reactionaries. That's what the Republican Party ought to be, especially given the existing demographic trends and the party realignment, which we may have time to talk about a little bit. If the Republican Party could essentially be eliminated as a national contender, we could then have the Democratic Party splitting into two parts. And you could see it again this week. Obama wants to change CPI. Bernie Sanders, similar people in the House of Representatives, don't want it. And, of course, they're extremely intimidated by Obama. Again, you know, in the first term, he was the messiah who could walk on water. In the second term, he's simply a desperate demagogue that you saved, you union guys, you Democratic Party activists. He didn't come flying in on his seraph's wings. He had to be pulled up out of the muck of the Satan sandwich and similar debacles and reanimated himself. So he owes everybody big time. And this is what you're seeing on Twitter. You go there, people write, I didn't vote for this. Obama, this is not what we fought for. We didn't give you a second term so you could stab us in the back again. Well, again, as long as there was a Tea Party, they seem to be formidable. Obama could say, oh, I'm sorry, I have no choice. I got to make these concessions. They're just too much for me. Now, the Republicans are in chaos. The Tea Party is a laughingstock. How will Obama bring Boehner back from the dead and or resuscitate the chained CPI and the cause of killer cuts? We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, let's look for a minute at this sequester, right? And again, the sequester was another concession by Obama because of his ineptitude, because of his cowardice, his constant unilateral concessions, surrendering advantages to a brutal enemy in the open field, because that's, of course, his goal. He chooses to be defeated. He wants to be defeated because that's his assignment from Wall Street. That's what he understands as his role. As he told those bankers, I'm the only one between you and the pitchforks. So that's his job, to protect the bankers from the pitchforks. That's how he sees himself. But now let's look at what the sequester would mean. Sequester is a bad thing. It's part of the Satan sandwich. The argument here, of course, is that don't sell out, don't stab everybody in the back in order to avoid the events that will transpire, the sequester and the reversion to the Clinton tax rates. It's a funny contradiction. Right? The Democrats try to sell you Clinton as a golden age and his tax rates as the key to development. But woe if you go back to them now. All right, fine. We don't want the cuts, the tax increases to occur. The $2,000 on middle-ranking wage earners. But the argument is that once this has happened, it's going to be fairly easy to pass a bill that will revert to the lower tax rates on 98% and just leave the increases for the wealthy. And of course, from our point of view, the insanity of this entire thing is what happened to the Wall Street sales tax? What happened to an awareness that the one group in society that's not taxed is the Wall Street financiers, the 6 to 7 quadrillion, whatever the U.S. share of a 6 to 7 quadrillion turnover in stocks, bonds, derivatives, and other instruments is not taxed. And we're told that the top 6 money center banks have approximately 95% of the derivatives. Certainly they have, I think, 98% of the credit default swaps. You can see where this is all centered. And the tax on derivatives would occur, of course, on the notional value, the value of the underlying asset pledged. So that's what we want to do. The intervention has to be the Wall Street sales tax, 1% across the board. It does not go to the Federal Reserve. Somebody came forward this year saying, the Wall Street sales tax goes to the Federal Reserve. No, not if you fight for it to go someplace else, right? So far, there is no Wall Street sales tax at the federal level in the form that we want it. So all those details are open to political pressure. We did have the National Nurses United come forward on the 10th of December. In terms of the United Front Against Austerity, I think we're in a holding pattern at the moment in terms of nationwide protest actions. In various places, for example, New York City, we've maintained a program of agitation and intervention during this past week, that is to say the last week before the Christmas week. We've been active there also in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in some other places. But as far as taking to the streets here in Washington, for example, this has not, the proper occasion for this, as far as I can see, has not presented itself. But we want to hold everything in readiness for emergency protest demonstrations, emergency actions to stop various forms of killer cuts from going through. We got to look now in the days after Christmas. I would say between now and Christmas, so into the middle of the following week. When you're hearing this, that's going to be not a propitious time to try to demonstrate. But perhaps after Christmas, and certainly any time we get announcements of the draconian austerity, the brutal, savage stuff that Obama and Boehner both want, which actually the Tea Party wants also. They just don't want the tax component. We'll be ready to go into action. So keep checking the United Front Against Austerity website. Keep checking Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Keep checking Tarpley.net, and we'll be in action soon enough. But again, don't worry about the going over the fiscal cliff. This is not such a big deal, because remember, the forces of austerity will all be weaker in the new year than they are now. There'll be fewer Republicans. Some of them will be gone. The availability of a pool of lame ducks who are willing to vote for anything in order to get jobs with Wall Street after they leave political life, they'll be gone. Obama will be chastened, and his ability to blackmail his own House Democrats caucus in particular will be diminished. But now let's look at there are real problems with the sequester, and these would have to be rolled back just about immediately. One is that the extended unemployment benefits would disappear. That's obviously a very bad thing. And here we go. Politico instructs us, if we don't, if this is not avoided, right? This could also be avoided by legislation, although they'll never do it. The doctors and hospitals who still accept Medicare will be hit twice. They will be hit once by the sequester, and secondly by the lack of a doc fix. Now let's just look at the sequester. This is easy. If nothing happens on the legislative front, then there will be a 2% cut in payments to Medicare providers and private Medicare Advantage plans under sequestration. Now, the Medicare Advantage plans, that's not a big deal. That these insurance companies can eat those costs. The Medicare providers, that's more serious. Even a 2% cut under sequestration can drive labs and other facilities, testing labs, can be driven out of business. This we don't want. But the really big one is the question of the doc fix. In other words, the Medicare legislation includes totally unrealistic austerity measures that have got to be rolled back every year. That's the doc fix. And the doc fix this time around would represent a 26.5% cut in what is paid for treating Medicare patients. And there would also be cuts for ambulatory services, rehabilitation therapies, physical therapy, and all the rest of this. So it would become a cut of 28.5% for many doctors and hospitals that still accept Medicare, and that's getting to be, not so much the rule. The number of doctors and hospitals that still accept Medicare is constantly falling, precisely because of this lunacy with Obama that he thinks you can gouge the payments to providers and hide behind that. So the other thing is the National Institutes of Health would take a $2.5 billion hit, meaning 2,300 fewer research grants. That's a disaster. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, if no legislative action takes place, you'd think that Obama would be calling attention, pointing with alarm to this, that it would be important to have legislation now to carry out at least the 26.5% doc fix and to rescind the 2% across-the-board cut in payments to Medicare providers in particular. But this doesn't interest him because he's interested in getting the chained CPI. But that's what's going to happen. National Institutes of Health would lose $2.5 billion on the sequester. That's 2,300 fewer research grants. The Food and Drug Administration, you think they have too much money? You're interested in having some mad cow disease or something of this sort? Well, they're going to get a $320 million cut out of a $3.9 billion budget. They are very heavy in personnel costs. That would be about 1,000 inspectors and similar people laid off from the Food and Drug Administration. So these are some of the problems that come with the sequester. And you look at the Capitol Hill press, right? Politico, The Hill, Roll Call, and so forth. Here we have the American Society of Clinical Oncology. 13 million Americans who have been diagnosed with cancer are counting on you. They face a triple threat from sequestration. Cancer research takes a hit. Access to health care will be hindered by cuts to cancer care providers. New oncology treatments will be delayed by budget reductions to federal review and oversight. So that looks pretty awful. Cancer patients should not be political pawns, and you can just extend that across the broad range of other programs. So this is the logic of austerity, right? Here in this season of the rolling year, when want is most keenly felt and abundance rejoices, we've got a capital which is completely dominated by austerity. Obama, completely unable to control the ideological atmosphere, has accepted to have jobs pushed aside, economic recovery never mentioned. These don't count. 30 million unemployed and underemployed, never hear about them. Hear about the fiscal cliff. We don't hear about a depression. We don't hear about the need for a recovery program from these bums. And then he accepts the logic of austerity, right? Remember, the supreme irony of all this is that the austerity cuts that all of these characters seem to think are necessary in greater or lesser measures, they are futile and destructive. When you make those cuts, you will never balance your budget. Never. It will never happen. The deficits will grow and grow and grow, and your national debt will grow and grow. So the measures that you're applying to deal with this problem, if that's what it is, they make it worse. If that's what you think the problem is, then you shouldn't be doing these things, because they have historically been proven to make it worse, from Britain all the way down to Greece and Spain and everybody else in between who's tried austerity. It just doesn't work. You need a recovery program, because if you cut spending in the current year, then in the out years, they'll have the problems that wage earners have been turned into welfare victims and so on down the line. So your social costs will go up. And if you don't want to pay the social costs, then you can pay your troops to go out and try to suppress riots. You'll destroy the society that you live in. So that's where we are. Now we'll look at a couple of the human types. The Mayan calendar has not delivered the promised apocalypse, at least not as of 2:42 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time on the 21st of December. The world has not ended after all. It's kind of like Ron Paul's hyperinflationary crisis. So far, we're still waiting. Things like that can happen, but you can't make that into a plank of your program over 20 to 30 years, as some people have done. The Mayan apocalypse has not occurred, but there's still grave danger that the Maya apocalypse will occur. And that's Maya McGuinness. It's written Maya McGuinness, as Scrooge would say, right? Pounds, guineas, shillings, and pence That's what he wanted, right? The guinea is 21 shillings, right? It used to be a little bit more than a pound. Maya McGuinness, or Maya McGuinness, is one of the harbingers of this doom. This is this group called Fix the Debt, and we can just focus on them very briefly to get an idea of who's behind a lot of this hysteria. This is Maya McGuinness. Okay, she's a think tanker. She's somebody with no real economic qualifications. She's a political hack left over from Clinton, but at a certain moment in her life, she meets the reincarnation of Ebenezer Scrooge called Al Simpson, this hater of humanity, this incurable misanthrope who hates old people. I guess he must hate sick people. He must hate young people. He hates the defenseless and the poor. He's a Republican. What do you want? Simpson converts her to the cause of austerity, and then the money is provided, of course, by Peter Peterson. Peter Peterson, the former head of Lehman Brothers, the infamous counting house that started the panic that just about brought down the world economy, blew out the U.S. banking system. Lehman Brothers. This character, Peter Peterson, has the gall to come forward and say that entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, Pell Grants, all the things that everybody in every age bracket needs in a depressed economy like this one. Peter Peterson argues that's the cause of the crisis. Now, that's not how the crisis occurred. It's just not how it happened. You can go back. You can remember. It started as a derivatives panic in the Wall Street zombie banks. And it started with Countrywide. It then went over to Northern Rock. Then it became Bear Stearns in March of 2008. And then in the infamous September 2008, it became Lehman Brothers, followed by everybody else. They were all bankrupt, all of them, every last one of them, every one of the 6 remaining money center zombie banks. But Peterson has been attempting to influence this culture, in particular the Strauss and Howe, right, the books of generations. If you're going to read it, he says he basically told these people, guys, you can write whatever you want and I'll support you, but whenever you get to the baby boomers, you got to write that their duty to human civilization is to destroy the entitlements that were somehow possible in 1935 in the depths of the Depression, but which people like Peter Peterson don't want to pay for today. So now, Maya McGuinness, busy entrepreneur, has created this bunch of scam artists called Fix the Debt. And what this is, this allows sociopaths to come forward as paragons of civic virtue. Let's take some examples. She's got this character, Dave Coate of Honeywell. And Honeywell comes on there. She's got another guy called from Caesar's Palace, right? The gambling casinos, right, in the orbit of organized crime. And they come forward on the radio here in Washington anyway, and they say, oh, it's time to be fiscally responsible, right? The entitlements are going to have to take a hit. And we've had Blankfein, who's also part of this group, saying the same thing. She's got 125 top CEOs. My proposal is this, that these characters should have to wear jerseys, like football jerseys. We want to know what percent of your corporate profits did you pay in taxes. Remember, the federal law supposedly says that the federal corporate income tax is 35%. Well, if this guy Dave Coate comes on, his says 0%. And if Immelt comes on, it's going to say minus 43%, because he gets money back from the federal government. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's the last segment here on our Christmas program 2012. We've compared the fate of Obama, Boehner, and the rest of these austerity ghouls. They will face the future of Jacob Marley chained to the chained CPI that they want to impose on the rest of us. The only hope we have right now is the Tea Party, by sabotaging all of their rotten compromises, will somehow prevent any action. That's an eminently feasible possibility right now. And that would actually be the lesser evil compared to these plans that Obama and Boehner are negotiating. Remember, we don't want bipartisanship. We want the most acrimonious clash. We want gridlock unless and until alternatives emerge that we want. Now, let's say a few words about the Connecticut school massacre. Preface, guns are a wedge issue. Don't ever forget it. Guns are a wedge issue. They're a classic wedge issue. They belong to the political cycle, which is now closed. That's when they emerged, 1968 to 2008. Guns, God, gays. These issues are all, although of interest to some, beside the point on the big stuff. The big stuff is economics. That's where you want to put your effort. Don't be led into making gun control the main issue. Gun control is not the main issue. Don't waste your time on it, because there are already ponderous forces in the field on that. The front you want to go to is the Wall Street sales tax, because that's where small forces and agitating loudly can make a big difference by putting on the agenda an idea whose time has come. But when it comes to the Connecticut school massacre, another preface is that Obama is using this. The Democratic Party in general wants to get a gun control hysteria going, because with that, they will get left cover. They have to refurbish their left cover. It's been rather frayed lately, right? What with Afghanistan, what with killer drones and Terror Tuesdays and the rest of it, right? Obama's left-wing sheen has been largely compromised. So he thinks that with the gun control, he can sort of refurbish his left cover, and then using that, he can stab you in the back. That's when he has the capability to beat down the Progressive Caucus and the rest of these people who might otherwise complain, the Bernie Sanders of the world, shut them up and proceed with the chain CPI and similar measures, the human toll of which far exceeds these terrible events of the last month. Now, in terms of the immediate specifics of the Connecticut school massacre, I would simply say, take a look at my Twitter feed. We have WCBS Channel 2 New York, as well as the CBS affiliate in Hartford, Connecticut, reflecting the events in this small town of the Housatonic River Valley, sadly enough, Newtown, Connecticut. The official version has now emerged. What I did in the first hours of this, and I've captured these quotes, is to go to a number of websites. What we find there is that John Miller of CBS News, who was a former deputy director of the FBI, he's somebody who wrote a book about 9/11. He was part of the, how can I say it? He was part of shepherding the explosion in 1993 at the World Trade Center. He's part of that group, but now a CBS correspondent. He reported that a possible second shooter had been arrested in the woods wearing camouflage. Well, the details emerged later. So John Miller, he reported it. And then Pete Williams, the NBC Justice correspondent, reported the same thing. So we got CBS News and NBC News report that a possible second shooter was arrested in the woods. And the CBS local affiliates there in Connecticut and New York City have an eyewitness, a blonde guy, and you can see this. I put this out as a tweet, I believe on the 19th or 20th here of December. You can follow that link if it's still there. They're disappearing. To a guy who says that this guy was in the woods. He was wearing camouflage pants and a black jacket or black top somehow. And this guy was put into a police car and kept saying, "I didn't do it." Now, the inherent problem of these official stories is always the second shooter, as we've seen. In the case of Major Hassan at Fort Hood, there were reports of a second shooter. In the case of Breivik in Norway in the spring-summer of 2011, there are very, very detailed reports of a second shooter, in this case with detailed eyewitness reports. In the case of Mutalab, the Christmas Day 2009 underwear bomber, it was a well-dressed man who brought him to the check-in and got him on the plane, and so forth. So whenever you've got a second shooter, you have exited the realm of the lone assassin and the lone troubled individual. And the problem that we have now is, even though These second shooter reports were very prominent in the initial hours. They've all disappeared, and they've disappeared without any comment. In other words, they've just been sanitized. They've been scrubbed from the websites. It's as if they didn't occur. Well, I did take the precaution of copying these things, getting some screenshots and so forth. So there is no doubt that it was there. And even the NBC Evening News last Friday had to say that one of the main problems of the Connecticut events was that so much disinformation had been put into circulation. In other words, the information management side of this seems to have been the weakest that we've had in recent years. Now, what do we do about all this? As I say, don't be lured into making this the main issue. Again, there's nothing that light forces can do about this. There's no way that intervening on one or the other sides of this is going to lead to anything. I, at the same time, have to call attention to the unreality of the, what can we say, the gun fetishists. We got people who think that gun ownership is by itself a political act. It is not. Gun ownership gets you nowhere politically. Indeed, it can get you in negative just as well as positive directions. The gun hysteria is a feature of the past 40 years. It has to do with the reactionary cycle, which we should be exiting about now, which we could be exiting, and maybe we even are. But, of course, it's all up for grabs. It's all going to be determined by struggle and free will and human agency. But the possibility is that the prominence of guns as a wedge issue could recede. That would be the goal, to eclipse that with class struggle on economic issues and not be diverted into these questions, because the guns yes or guns no will never get you out of a world economic depression and will never reduce the threat of a general war of the type that we have today. The gun fetishist argues, I think in the last analysis, that guns are essential, that they're somehow more than a hobby, more than sports, more than hunting, but they're a means of defense against the totalitarian government. And I have to say, bunk, baloney. Let's look at these people, right? The people who are most vociferous about guns, what did they spend 2011, 2012 doing? Behind the, with their guns in the closet, or maybe even on display, they came out and supported Ron Paul's fascist economics, the cut of 62% in food stamps. That's genocide. Sorry. If you have 50 million people who are living on $1.50 per person per meal, and you say, I'm going to cut that to 50 cents per person per meal, that will kill people. So the idea that somehow the gun owners, with their reactionary libertarian mentality, are somehow a guarantee against totalitarian government, I don't see it. And rather, I see that they're just as likely to become gangs on the side of the strikebreakers, quite frankly. So I would guide you away from this issue. This is not where the future of the world will be decided. Tragic as these events certainly are deplorable, and of course we join in condemning them. It's important to maintain the focus where big changes can be made through the intervention of small groups of people. That's called the Wall Street sales tax. That's called seizing the Fed and using it to finance a recovery. So let's conclude our Christmas broadcast with Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and all other applicable festivities to all. See you next week. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., and this is now our Christmas program. It's December 21st here in Washington, and time for the next to last program of the old year of 2012. The apocalyptic thinkers, right? The people who expected the end of the world have been disappointed so far. The Mayan calendar does not seem to be kicking in. We don't have the Mayan apocalypse, but we have the Maya apocalypse. We'll talk about that in our second segment. That is the austerity ghoul Maya McGinnis as a kind of typical harpy or fury tormenting humanity with genocidal austerity. We'll get to her in the second part of the program. But, if you listen to Ron Paul's standard stump speech in his campaign, it was full of apocalyptic ideas. For some reason, always hyperinflation, never deflation, always hyperinflation. That doesn't seem to come about. As the scripture says, you don't know when, right? You do not know when. Believe me, you don't know when. And as I would add, every prediction of the end of the world has a definite class content. And when Helicopter Ben Bernanke coined the term, the fiscal cliff, earlier this year, he did that as part of a very specific strategy of ruling class demagogy designed to advance the interests of the parasitic banking elite and the lunatic ruling class, the so-called 1%. It said that inflation was too much, and therefore the entitlement beneficiaries were getting increases that were too generous, right? Their cost of living allowances and adjustments were too big. So already with Boskin 20 years ago, there was a first gouging and reduction in the way that the actual rate of inflation is reflected, right? It's clear to everybody. You can go to these libertarians, for example, at Shadow Government Statistics and see their estimate of what the consumer price index really has been. It has been much more than what the government is willing to admit. And you don't have to be a Ron Paul freak to recognize that fact. But so now we got the second round. So what the idea is that over time, Social Security would wither on the vine. The benefit would become less and less and less until eventually it dried up and blew away. That's the chained CPI. Now, Boehner, from a position of overwhelming weakness, of ideological isolation, and being on the defensive, can nevertheless rely, could and can, on Obama to try not just to bail him out, but to shower him with concessions that he could never get in a real negotiation. We've always said Obama negotiates with himself, a strange habit that he has. Obama negotiates with himself. At the beginning, you may recall, he wanted $1.6 trillion of revenue. Well, actually, let me go back even further. Before this year, before this current haggling session, back in the spring of 2011, Obama already granted $1 trillion in killer cuts. And I say killer cuts because any cuts in social programs represent genocide. They will kill people. It's a big difference. You can raise taxes on the rich by 5% or 10%, sure in the knowledge that you're not killing anybody. At the beginning, Social Security is off the table. And suddenly, in the course of this past week, Social Security came back in through the back door in time to be looted and chiseled and gouged and sacked. And this is the chained CPI. This is a piece of monstrosity. You've often heard it said on this program, the difference between Romney and Obama was what? Well, that Romney was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a madman coming at you with a chainsaw and determined to impose killer cuts immediately, right? To basically hack everybody into succotash in the first 3 minutes. With the case of Obama, it's the death of 1,000 cuts. And that is what the chained CPI would do to the average Social Security benefit, right? We have the shills of MSNBC, Larry O'Donnell, or whatever his name is, this nonentity who does the 10 o'clock program on MSNBC, he assures us, oh, well, the chained CPI, that would only mean 1%. Yeah, 1% maybe the first year, but in the successive years, it's going to be 1% and 1% and 1% and maybe more on compound interest. The trick is that they want to understate inflation. This is not the first time they've done it. Going back 20 years, pick up a copy of Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History, the first edition, 1999, and the second edition, 2009. You will find in there a discussion of a similar gouging and falsification of the consumer price index carried out by the infamous Michael Boskin, who was a creature of the first Bush administration, that is to say, of Bush the elder. And his story was that the existing CPI of the Labor Department at that point, the market basket of goods and their prices, he said it overstated inflation. We are now in the midst of the haggling over this fiscal cliff, this chimera. There is, of course, there is real damage that is set to occur, but the idea that this is somehow the end of the world, this is wrong, and also it's perfectly susceptible to being cured after the fact in the new year. It was widely admitted this week, even in the controlled media, that if you're on the side of working people, you have no particular phobia about allowing the Bush tax cuts to lapse. That can then be fixed relatively easily. But the idea that somehow it's a public interest to avoid the Bush tax cuts, that you think about that, right? That we have to hang on to what Bush did. Well, this is also fallacy, and it plays into the hands of the reactionaries. But now we've got the Republican reactionaries that have, for the moment, blocked Obama's attempt for a sellout. Obama was determined to exact his pound of flesh. He wanted to impose the controlled consumer price index, the so-called chained CPI, the chained consumer price index. And this is a way to gouge Social Security. And a breathtaking reversal. Going into the haggling about the fiscal cliff, Obama, the man of the people, who ran on a platform of defending the entitlements, although if you were reading carefully, as some of us were, you could see that he intended no such thing, that he was always eager for a sellout. But in his campaign, he tried to give the dupes, the low-information voters, the notion that he was there to defend entitlements, the social safety net, your economic rights as validated by the New Deal, the Great Society, and the New Frontier. But he said that if you gouge 5 to 10% out of food stamps or Medicaid or Medicare or unemployment benefits, you can be sure that human lives will be lost. Dead bodies will result. That is why the current austerity proposals represent high crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg Code, the implied precedents of the Nuremberg trials, Germany 1946, where austerity ghouls of that age, also known as Nazis, were hanged for what they did. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., our special Christmas program. We will have some holiday atmosphere here before too long, but we've got to bring you up to date, first of all, on the infamy and treachery of Obama, the reactionary furor of Boehner and his gang of Republican thugs. This is plain to all to see. Quite a few still having trouble seeing the depths of the treachery of Obama. So we got through 2011. As a result of the events of 2010 and 2011, Obama had signed off on $1 trillion, a lot of that killer cuts, a lot of it targeting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. He had already targeted those cuts, and he had and part of Obamacare, one of the main things wrong with Obamacare is that contains between $500 billion and $700 billion, according to the accounting you use, of cuts. Those are killer cuts. They may not be cuts to the benefits received by individuals nominally, but when you go and cut payments to hospitals, payments to laboratories, payments to other key parts of the healthcare delivery system, that will also lead to increased morbidity and mortality. Those are killer cuts. This is not comparable to the effect of tax increases on rich people. Those do not kill. But cutting into these programs on which people